What most people misunderstand about avoidance is that the dynamic is rarely sustained by emotional connection alone. It is sustained by predictability. The avoidant unconsciously depends on knowing that no matter how distant they become, no matter how inconsistent their behavior gets, the other person will continue reaching back toward them. That certainty becomes emotionally regulating for them. Your pursuit becomes the safety net beneath their emotional detachment. And for a long time, you probably did exactly that. You explained yourself repeatedly. You tried to decode mixed signals. You looked for hidden meaning inside delayed replies, emotional coldness, and periods of withdrawal. You convinced yourself that if you could just love harder, communicate better, stay more patient, or become more understanding, eventually they would feel safe enough to fully show up. But what you did not realize at the time was that your constant emotional availability was unintentionally protecting them from consequences. Because as long as you remained emotionally present, they never had to fully confront the impact of their distance. This is why the moment you genuinely stopped caring in the same way, the emotional atmosphere shifted so dramatically. Not performatively, not as manipulation, but internally, quietly. You stopped chasing explanations. You stopped trying to repair every emotional fracture by yourself. You stopped organizing your emotional life around someone else's inability to engage honestly. And the avoidant felt that shift immediately, even if they never admitted it aloud. People think avoidants only react to dramatic endings. That is rarely true. What unsettles them most is emotional absence without chaos. When there is no longer pleading, arguing, or emotional pursuit, they lose the framework that allowed them to remain comfortably disconnected. Your emotional reactions once gave them orientation. Even conflict reassured them that the attachment still existed. But indifference, real emotional detachment, creates psychological uncertainty they cannot easily manage. Suddenly the game changes, because now they are no longer responding to your emotions. They are trapped alone with their own, and this is where something fascinating begins to happen psychologically. The avoidant often starts replaying interactions they previously dismissed. Moments they minimized suddenly gain emotional weight. Your patience becomes visible in hindsight. Your consistency becomes undeniable. The emotional labor you carried becomes impossible to ignore once it disappears. Human beings are remarkably skilled at overlooking stabilizing forces while they are still present. We tend to notice emotional safety most clearly after it is removed. That is why your withdrawal hits differently. Not because it wounded their ego alone, although it often does, but because it interrupted a psychological pattern they unconsciously depended on. Avoidants often operate with the assumption that emotional reconnection can happen whenever they decide they are ready. They delay vulnerability because they believe attachment will remain available indefinitely. Your constant presence reinforced that belief. They thought there would always be another conversation, another chance, another emotional opening waiting for them when it became convenient. But when your energy changed, they encountered something they were not emotionally prepared for. Uncertainty about losing you permanently. And uncertainty is deeply destabilizing for someone who relies on emotional distance to maintain control. What makes this even more profound is that your detachment forces the avoidant into direct confrontation with themselves. Before, their attention remained fixed on managing your emotions, your reactions, your expectations, your attempts to connect. But once you stop participating in that cycle, there is nothing left to distract them from their own internal world. The silence becomes reflective. They begin encountering emotions they previously outran through withdrawal, regret, curiosity, anxiety, not always expressed outwardly. Avoidants are rarely dramatic in the way anxious attachers are. Their turmoil is often internalized, quiet, delayed, but psychologically significant nonetheless. And many avoidants experience a kind of emotional disorientation when they realize the person who once fought hardest for the connection has become emotionally unavailable to dysfunction. Because deep down, they expected your emotional endurance to outlast their inconsistency. They believed your care was permanent. That belief collapsing changes everything. This is also why attempts to win back an avoidant through over-explanation usually fail. The more emotionally available you become in response to their distance, the safer they feel maintaining the same behavior. But when your energy genuinely shifts towards self-respect, emotional stability, and inner peace, you create something far more powerful than persuasion. You create consequence. And consequence is often the first thing that forces real reflection. Because eventually the avoidant realizes something uncomfortable. The person they relied on emotionally is no longer standing in the same place waiting for them. And by the time they fully understand what they lost, your silence has already said everything words never could. What makes this dynamic even more psychologically complex is that avoidants are often far more emotionally dependent than they appear. They simply express dependency differently. Most people imagine emotional dependence as visible attachment needing reassurance, asking for closeness, openly expressing fear of abandonment. But avoidants frequently depend on something much quieter: emotional access without emotional responsibility. They want to know you are there. They want to feel your emotional availability surrounding them like a safety net, but they also want enough distance to avoid confronting the vulnerability real intimacy requires. And for a long time, your emotional energy may have fulfilled both roles. Your consistency allowed them to feel connected without fully participating in the emotional depth of the relationship. Even when they withdrew, even when they became cold or unavailable, some part of them trusted that your care remained intact. That certainty became psychologically regulating for them. Your presence stabilized emotions they did not know how to regulate internally. This is why your emotional independence affects them so deeply. Because the moment you stopped organizing your emotional state around their behavior, they lost access to the external emotional structure they had quietly relied upon. Suddenly, your peace no longer revolved around whether they texted back, opened up emotionally, or validated the connection. You stopped treating their inconsistency as the center of your emotional universe. And that shift forces the avoidant into an unfamiliar psychological position. Now they must sit with themselves. That sounds simple on the surface, but psychologically, it is one of the hardest experiences for an avoidant person. Avoidants are not emotionless people. In fact, many of them feel emotions very intensely. The difference is that they learned early in life that vulnerability felt unsafe, overwhelming, disappointing, or emotionally consuming. So instead of developing healthy emotional processing, they developed emotional distancing as a survival strategy. Distance became regulation. Detachment became control. Withdrawal became protection. But when you stopped emotionally chasing them, you unintentionally removed one of their primary distractions. Before, their attention could remain focused on managing your emotions, interpreting your reactions, or creating space from intimacy. But once you emotionally stepped back, there was no longer anything external to regulate against. Emotional noise disappeared. And in silence, unresolved feelings become louder. This is where many avoidants begin experiencing something they rarely admit openly: emotional emptiness. Not because they never cared about you, but because they built so much of their emotional structure around avoidance itself that they never fully developed the internal stability genuine intimacy requires. Your presence had been filling emotional spaces they did not even realize existed. The reassurance, attention, patience, and emotional consistency you offered became woven into their psychological comfort system. And human beings often fail to appreciate emotional stability until it disappears. That is why your growth unsettles them so profoundly. When they see you becoming calmer, stronger, more emotionally grounded without their involvement, it challenges a hidden assumption they carried about the relationship. They believed your emotional connection to them was permanent. They assumed some part of you would always remain emotionally tethered, waiting, hoping, reacting. But now they see something different. They see someone who no longer needs emotional crumbs to feel valuable. Someone who stopped negotiating for basic emotional presence. Someone who discovered peace outside the relationship dynamic entirely. And psychologically, that creates a mirror they cannot easily escape. Because your healing exposes their stagnation. Your emotional balance highlights the chaos they still suppress internally. Your self-respect confronts the emotional avoidance they continue using as protection. This is why many avoidants begin resurfacing emotionally after you stop needing them. It is not always manipulation, although sometimes it can be. Often it is confusion. They are trying to understand why the emotional dynamic no longer feels controllable. The person who once centered them emotionally has become emotionally self-sufficient. And that forces the avoidant to confront a painful realization. They may have mistaken your love for permanence. There is also a philosophical truth underneath all of this that people rarely discuss. Human beings tend to value what stabilizes them only after its absence creates emotional instability. We adapt quickly to emotional safety. We normalize kindness. We overlook consistency because it becomes familiar. But once that emotional grounding disappears, the nervous system notices immediately. The avoidant notices your absence not only emotionally, but structurally. Your energy once softened their anxiety without them fully acknowledging it. Your patience once absorbed tensions they could not process alone. Your emotional openness once created a bridge back to connection whenever they felt isolated from themselves. And when all of that disappears, they are left facing the emotional architecture they spent years avoiding. The loneliness becomes different. The silence becomes heavier. Because now, there is no emotionally available person compensating for their inability to connect deeply. And this is where the real shift happens. Your emotional independence stops being about them entirely. It becomes about reclaiming ownership over your own inner world. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's emotional limitations. You stop interpreting emotional unavailability as a challenge to overcome. You stop abandoning yourself to maintain proximity to someone unwilling to meet you fully. And ironically, that is often the exact moment the avoidant begins feeling the emotional weight of losing you. Because nothing exposes emotional emptiness more clearly than watching someone else finally become emotionally whole without you. And by the time they recognize the depth of what your presence once gave them, your absence has already begun teaching the lesson they refused to learn while you were still there. One of the most unsettling experiences for an avoidant is realizing that the version of you they once relied upon emotionally no longer exists. And I do not mean you became cold, bitter, or emotionally hardened. I mean something much deeper changed. Your relationship to yourself evolved. The emotional patterns that once kept you trapped inside the cycle began dissolving. The person who tolerated confusion in the name of love slowly disappeared. And avoidants feel that transformation long before they fully understand it. At first, they often assume your distance is temporary. They interpret your silence as another emotional reaction that will eventually pass. Because historically, no matter how hurt, exhausted, or emotionally neglected you became, you still returned emotionally. You still searched for clarity. You still fought to preserve the connection. In their mind, that version of you became predictable. But healing changes predictability, and that is where the psychological shock begins. Because eventually your energy no longer carries the same emotional urgency. You stop monitoring their moods. You stop feeling responsible for repairing emotional distance you did not create. You stop chasing reassurance from someone incapable of consistently providing it. What once triggered anxiety inside you now creates observation. What once pulled you into emotional overthinking now feels strangely clear. That shift is profoundly destabilizing for avoidants because the emotional system they unconsciously depended on suddenly stops functioning the same way. Their old strategies no longer produce the same results. Withdrawal no longer pulls you closer. Silence no longer provokes emotional pursuit. Mixed signals no longer keep you emotionally attached. And for many avoidants, this creates an identity-level disturbance they cannot easily process. Because part of their emotional security came from believing they understood how the relationship dynamic worked. They believed distance created leverage. They believed emotional ambiguity maintained control. They believed your emotional endurance was infinite. But now they are facing someone emotionally different, someone calmer, someone less reactive, someone who no longer interprets emotional inconsistency as love. And perhaps most importantly, someone who no longer needs emotional validation from them in order to feel whole. This is why many avoidants begin behaving strangely once they sense your transformation. Some become more attentive suddenly. Others begin testing emotional access again through small messages, indirect contact, nostalgia, or subtle emotional openings. Not necessarily because they have fully transformed internally, but because they feel the shift in power emotionally. The dynamic they once understood has changed without their permission. And human beings are deeply unsettled when familiar emotional structures disappear. But there is another layer to this that goes even deeper psychologically. What the avoidant often mourns is not only your absence, it is the loss of the emotional version of you that made avoidance possible in the first place. That version of you absorbed uncertainty. It overextended empathy. It rationalized emotional neglect. It remained emotionally available even when reciprocity was inconsistent. And once that version disappears, the avoidant loses access to a certain kind of emotional comfort they quietly depended on. Because contrary to popular belief, avoidants do not always want relationships to end. Often, they want connection without the emotional exposure true intimacy requires. They want proximity without accountability. They want reassurance without vulnerability. And your old self unknowingly accommodated that imbalance because your love kept prioritizing understanding over self-protection. But growth changes what a person can emotionally tolerate. At some point, self-respect begins overriding emotional addiction. You start recognizing that constantly proving your worth to emotionally unavailable people is not love. It is self-abandonment disguised as devotion. And once that realization becomes internalized, your behavior changes naturally, not through performance, not through manipulation, but through emotional clarity. That clarity is what the avoidant struggles to understand. Because emotionally healthy detachment feels foreign to someone accustomed to unstable attachment patterns. They expect intensity, they expect pursuit, they expect emotional volatility. But your peace creates something they cannot predict. You are no longer emotionally negotiating for connection. You are no longer trying to convince someone to value what they repeatedly mishandled. And psychologically, that forces them into confrontation with regret. Not always conscious regret at first. Sometimes it appears as curiosity, restlessness, obsessive thinking, random memories resurfacing unexpectedly. A growing awareness that the emotional access they once took for granted no longer exists in the same form. Because people rarely recognize transformation while it is happening slowly. They notice it once the emotional doorway closes behind them. And that is why your evolution hits the avoidant so deeply. They expected your attachment to remain frozen in time while they figured themselves out emotionally. They assumed your emotional loyalty would survive endless inconsistency. But healing moved you forward while they remained psychologically attached to an outdated version of you, a version that no longer exists. And this creates one of the most painful realizations an avoidant can experience. Sometimes the person they miss is not the current you. It is the version of you that accepted less than you deserved. But once someone truly reconnects with their self-worth, that version rarely returns. Because growth changes your emotional standards permanently. You stop confusing longing with compatibility. You stop mistaking emotional struggle for depth. You stop romanticizing your own suffering. And when that transformation becomes complete, the avoidant eventually realizes something irreversible has happened. The person who once waited for them emotionally has finally walked beyond the reach of their old patterns. And by the time they fully understand the value of who you became, they are already grieving the version of you they can never get back. What ultimately changes everything for the avoidant is not anger. It is not revenge. It is not dramatic confrontation. It is the moment your silence stops being temporary and becomes permanent in spirit. Because there is a profound psychological difference between someone reacting emotionally and someone emotionally releasing you completely. Avoidants are often highly accustomed to cycles. Distance followed by reconnection. Withdrawal followed by return. Emotional shutdown followed by small moments of intimacy that reopen the attachment again. Over time, this rhythm creates an unconscious expectation inside the avoidant mind. No matter how disconnected things become, emotional access to you will still exist later. That assumption becomes dangerous because it allows emotional procrastination. The avoidant delays vulnerability because they believe there will always be more time. More time to explain themselves, more time to reconnect, more time to process their emotions privately before fully showing up. They convince themselves the relationship is still emotionally available even while neglecting it. And as long as you continue reopening the emotional door every time they return, that belief remains intact. But your silence eventually became different, not louder, not crueler, just final. And finality is psychologically devastating for people who built their emotional security around delayed emotional engagement. Because now, for the first time, they cannot feel your emotional presence waiting in the background. They cannot sense the familiar emotional tether connecting them back to safety whenever they decide to reach for it. Your energy changed completely. You stopped emotionally hovering around the relationship. You stopped leaving parts of yourself psychologically available to someone who consistently treated intimacy as something optional. That shift creates a form of emotional confrontation avoidance are rarely prepared for, because silence removes distraction. When there are no more arguments, no more emotional explanations, no more attempts to repair the disconnect, the avoidant is left alone with something they spent years escaping. Unresolved emotional reality. And unresolved emotions do not disappear simply because they were avoided. In fact, avoidance often intensifies emotional experiences over time because nothing is ever fully processed. So eventually the memories begin surfacing differently, not through nostalgia alone, but through recognition. They begin recognizing moments where you chose understanding over ego. Moments where you tried to create emotional safety despite your own exhaustion. Moments where your patience exceeded what most people would have tolerated. And perhaps most painfully, they begin recognizing how casually they treated emotional access that was actually rare. Human beings are remarkably blind to emotional value when they assume it will always remain available. But once permanence disappears, perception changes rapidly. This is why many avoidants experience delayed grief. While emotionally secure people tend to process relational loss more directly and immediately, avoidants often suppress the emotional impact at first. They intellectualize it, minimize it, distract themselves from it. But emotional suppression is not emotional resolution. The nervous system keeps records the conscious mind tries to escape, and silence gives those buried emotions room to rise. Suddenly, your absence is no longer theoretical. It becomes experiential. The avoidant notices the lack of your emotional energy in quiet moments. They notice the absence of your reassurance during stressful periods. They notice there is no longer someone emotionally holding space for them while asking for almost nothing in return. And what once felt easy to postpone now feels impossible to recover. Because the hardest thing for avoidants to process is not rejection, it is irretrievability. The realization that someone they deeply affected emotionally may no longer be emotionally reachable in the same way. And that realization often arrives late, very late. By the time many avoidants fully understand what they lost, the other person has already emotionally reorganized their life. The attachment that once revolved around hope has transformed into acceptance. The emotional dependency has dissolved into self-trust. And perhaps most terrifying for the avoidant, your peace no longer depends on whether they return. That is when the emotional weight truly lands, because now they cannot reassure themselves with